Oh, hey, Amanda, we are live on Facebook.
Okay, let's give everyone just 4 more minutes to join, and then we'll begin at 25 to. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining the Black Sashes first Khuluma for 2021. We're so excited to have everybody here, and I'm very glad we started off with what's one of my favorite Abdullah Ibrahim songs. But controversially, I always say that people are far more interested in Manenberg, the song, than they are the community, which is a community that I think, as Zianda will probably tell us, many communities, and Eldred and everyone will tell us that many communities on the Cape Flats have never ever had a good experience with police, especially Manenberg. It's one of the highest areas of police violence and gang violence. But I think that this is a very important topic for the month that we've had. I said today that I can't believe it's still July, and what a July it has been in South Africa. It's the longest 31 days that it's ever been, and so much has happened and in such a short space of time. But especially in the area of policing, the the situation of both over policing and completely lackadaisical response from policing. And so this is why we are here today. The Khuluma is something that the Black Sash has every year. Sometimes we try to have multiple Khulumas a year, which is the isiZulu word for dialogue. And this is what we want today. The panelists will speak, but we also want as much participation from the audience also as we have this discussion. But I will let Rachel Bukasa, our director, kick us off with this topic. And I just want to thank everyone for attending what is an important, and I will be honest, it's a fundraising event so that we can continue the work of protecting communities. So over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you so much for making sure that we can organize this very important space to be able to deal with these issues that are so pertinent to our different communities. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We don't take it for granted that you made time out of your hectic schedules, particularly during the day like this, to be able to join us. As Amanda said, my name is Rachel Bukasa. I'm the National Director of Black Sash. And just to give you a little bit of context of why we're here and why we are wanting to discuss this. So essentially on the 15th of January 2021, social grant beneficiaries stood in a long congested queue outside the Belleville SASSA offices, where the police were on site to assist SASSA to manage the crowd. And as the crowd grew, what we found was that the police found that the only way they could control the crowd was to use water spray to ensure social distancing. As the Black Sash, along with many other people, we strongly condemned the police's use of force and the shameful and shocking disregard for human rights of the vulnerable beneficiaries, particularly if you take into account that the people that were standing in the queues were the elderly, were the sick people, and were the disabled people as well. There was no justification in our mind whatsoever for the use of water cannons to enforce social distancing. As SASSA had failed to provide an environment where this could have been done automatically without needing to use force on extremely vulnerable people. And so grant applicants and the recipients at the Belleville offices, many of them who are living with these conditions, were then forced to remain in, it was a rain and cold day, a rainy day. They were then forced to remain in those lines on a cold, wet day, having gotten additionally wet by the police water cannons. And so we see that the excessive use of force, that is just one example, but we see that in South Africa, it is slowly becoming a disturbing norm in the country. That is just one example of, I'm sure, many that other people here amongst us can bring up. And therefore, as a result, it must be condemned at all times. People who are queuing outside us,
Hey, Amanda, I think we might have lost Rachel because of network connectivity.
Okay. So yeah, let's just give Rachel a few seconds to try to log on. But in the meantime, I think that, let me do one thing and let me introduce our speakers. If you can just give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to just read a little bit about each speaker. And we have the exceptionally great speakers who are all policing experts. First, we have Zianda Stuurman, who is a social policy, political science, and international relations graduate. And she currently works as a social science researcher and policy manager based in Cape Town. the cold Cape Town right now. Zianda is a recipient of both the Shevin and the Fulbright Scholarship and holds advanced degrees in conflict, security, and development studies from Sussex University and international development from Brandeis University. Her undergraduate degree in international relations and political science are both from the University of Stellenbosch. She's worked in various roles in political and social science research over the past decade, ranging from a project manager for youth advocacy focused NGO to a policy researcher for a political party, which must have been a very interesting job in South Africa. And also done political risk analysis in the private sector. She has a rich history of student activism, research and writing, and is also a favorite for everyone on Twitter. Then we have Daniel Knutzer, who is the founder and editor of Viewfinder, which I would all encourage you to follow on Twitter and Facebook. His reporting focuses on police criminality and the future of policing oversight mechanisms in South Africa. This project was launched with a major expose on the country's policing watchdog in October 2019. He was a fellow with the US State Department's Hubert Humphrey Fellowship Program in 2017 and 18, during which time he did a professional affiliation at Revel from the Center of Investigative Reporting in San Francisco. Previously, he worked as a news reporter and a communications officer at an NGO in the NGO sector. I'm a big fan of people who work in the NGO sector. Aldert de Klerk is a policing expert and a director and senior associate of the African Center for Security and Intelligence Praxis, also known as ACSIP, which works on security and intelligence as a democratic and transformative praxis. As a comparative policing and social conflict specialist, he has led in conflict resolution facilitation and policing reform, electoral violence prevention, and the rule of law and security sector reform across Africa, as well as in Asia and Western Europe. So we are glad to be joined by three excellent panelists. And I see we still don't have Rachel back. Am I right, Ernest?
Yes, Rachel is not back as yet.
Okay, well, that's okay. We will kick it off. I think that Rachel did a good framing of the issues, especially where why this is such an important matter to the Black Sash, whose work is to focus on the rights of those social grant recipients who were the victim of police violence at Bellville. But while Rachel joins, I think we should see she has joined. Rachel, I've introduced the panelists, so I think we can start with Aldred if you're happy.
Absolutely. Apologies, technology and its weaknesses.
Yeah, it's cold in Cape Town. So yeah, I will switch my camera off, but Aldred, do you want to please introduce us to your work and how you feel about the future of policing in South Africa?
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you to my fellow panelists, Black Sash, for putting this together, and to all those who are participating wherever you may find yourself. May you be warm and snug on this day in South Africa, at the very least. Well, I sit quite anxious about the future of policing. I think we sit in a moment in time that if we don't take hold of the opportunity to have a very essential public-led process on the future of policing. So I thank Black Sash for being part of that and providing a platform where we can actually talk about the future of policing and the kind of police that we deserve. Because what I see is that there's a romance and a resistance to, well, a romance about how the police used to be and a reverting to the apartheid flavored policing that we've all experienced. And that there really isn't an understanding there, it seems, within the police of how do you position a South African police service in a developmental state like South Africa with all its dire poverty, gross inequalities, and quite frankly, corporate greed. And we mustn't forget that is not just the state that's so-called corrupt or complicit, but there's a huge corporate infrastructure and enterprise that actually follows suit. That also enables, in very many ways, for this to happen and undermine state efforts, I think, to fulfill the developmental agenda. So this dialogue, to me, is critical. We cannot have a transformation of the police service without the necessary political will to facilitate both the public process around policing and to consider what is the tenets and principles on which we're going to build this particular thing called policing. And this is a worldwide debate. It's led by the, defund the police debate. It's led by the get rid of the police debate. In South Africa, we seem to assume that we do need a police. And if we do need a police, what do we need this police to do? And how do we keep this police accountable? And let me just say something about accountability, because accountability for me is not punishment. It's not let's find who did what wrong. Accountability is actually about effectiveness. How effective is this police? How they're performing? How do we judge that performance? And if we do have questions, how freely and when can we ask this question? Before the fact and after the fact. And a lot of the work that I've been doing, and for my sins, I was there when we put this police together. We fired them all in one day, and we, by a stroke of a pen, rehired all of them. I've subsequently learned that you don't then leave it up to others to take forward the project of transformation and change, because all we've seen as and this is the moment. I think if we don't do something about it, we'll just see a realignment of deck chairs on the proverbial Titanic called the South African Police Service. And for me, the lesson learned is that if we are going to do this, the police cannot self-correct. They're going to need champions to self-correct, and they're going to need public leadership to make sure that it happens. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that input. I think that's really what you say is so powerful that, it's not sufficient to let someone just self-correct on their own. Yeah. Amanda?
Oh, yes. Oh, okay. I'm happy for you to carry on facilitating. I was just a doorstop while you were away.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you so much. Now we'll just hand over to Daniel. I think it's you. And we're just really keen to hear what you have to say.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for Amanda and Rachel and the team at Black Sash for hosting and making the space available. And thank you for all the participants. I see there's ample, and it's fantastic to see that there's such interest in the real imperative, I think, for South Africa and working class communities in particular in this country for a police service that is accountable, and certainly accountable in the sense that Aldred mentioned, from its performance, from its service, from what it brings to the constitutional kind of mandate that it's supposed to fulfill, but also accountable in terms of consequence management and an assurance that there's a disincentive for the kinds of behavior that you guys highlighted as inspiration for this webinar that we saw at the SASA offices outside in Belleville a couple of weeks ago. Unfortunately, these high-profile cases have a tendency to take our attention sometimes away from the real systemic and the prevalence and the absolute permeation of the use of violence and the abuse of force within the police service. And that has really been the focus of my work. My work is not a generalist. It's been highly concentrated, and I've looked at what the data and the statistics coming out of the police watchdog IPID both tells us about abuses, what people are reporting the police for, and the lack of accountability and the failure indeed of the oversight mechanism, of which IPID is only one, IPID being the police watchdog, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, is only one constituent part, working really hand in glove with police management, or at least should be. And I think one of my major findings and revelation of recent times is how police management and the failure of police management to really enforce its code of conduct, discipline, and ethics within the institution itself has given rise to a situation of impunity and enabling problem officers and non-accountability within the institution. So these numbers, let me just quickly highlight a couple of things that I think is important for people to understand when we look at the overview of what police abuse of force in South Africa looks like, or at least what we know about in terms of what's been reported. Since 2012, there's been more than 47,000 predominantly criminal complaints registered against the police with IPID. These relate to about 5,000 killings and deaths in custody. Of course, not all of those are allegations of unlawful killings, but are still probed. More than 6,000 shootings that are being probed, 30,000 assault complaints. And I think that's really where we look at the cultural acceptance of violence within the police service and the execution of police duties being elevated. Almost 1,000 rapes, a third of those having been alleged against police officers that were on duty in uniform at the time that they committed these alleged rapes, and 1,200 torture allegations. Many more torture allegations, I believe, are to be found in the assault statistics as well that are misclassified. That's the overview. That's the one thing that the data tells us, is that there's a serious problem of abuse of force and of violence within the day-to-day execution of policing duties. But another thing that the data tells us is the extent to which problem officers, and if we use the police's narrative, its own narrative, that these are select bad apples within the police service, problem officers being left unchecked. My recent analysis in terms of police officers that have been taken out of the system because of this, because of these complaints, is about 1 in 100, which means 99%, give or take, of police officers that are accused of these crimes remain in circulation, while their cases either penned for years at a time, sometimes are closed without a satisfactory outcome in terms of accountability. And that should be of massive concern. These statistics tell us what the problem is, but not exactly the reasons therefore. And that's been the subject of my investigation of late, both what the data and through a public records request, these numbers that I highlight, we've managed at Viewfinder to access the raw data, and that gives us a much deeper perspective of what both the trends within this use of force in the country is, this allegations of violent crimes, and the underpinnings, the processes that gives rise to that staggering statistic of what I believe to be 99% of police officers accused in these crimes remaining in circulation and not being dismissed or criminally prosecuted to the effect of imprisonment. And I think a big concern of late has been a realization that for all of our talk around independent civilian oversight of the police service in South Africa, an independent watchdog in IPID, which incidentally is a massively under-resourced institution, it is really up to police management to affect the recommendations and the findings against their own members. Disciplinary hearings happen on a balance of probabilities. The criminal justice system and criminal prosecution against police officers is fraught for a number of reasons, both specific to the issue of policing, police officers being charged, but also because of backlogs and the high burden of proof in courts. So really we're dependent on police management, and in this, a very small class of disciplinary officials to enact sanctions and to lead evidence and to make rulings on culpability on a balance of probabilities against their police colleagues, against whom findings of wrongdoing and misconduct related to these violence crimes have been made. And what I've found really is that this small group of senior police officers have it within their power to undo, scupper, and undermine sometimes the results of months-long investigations into police criminality through not properly affecting the findings and the recommendations against their own members. Recently, I unpacked a case study of what this means in a single case. Gauteng, incidentally, statistics show that they haven't disciplined a single police officer for violent crime since 2016. Now, we all know the challenges with data capturing, but having put that to Gauteng provincial management in the police, there was no response or explanation as to why that anomaly might be there. And indeed, it does look like it's very easy or very rare for police management to discipline and dismiss police officers accused of these crimes. That came to, and I will wrap up very soon. Sorry, am I still on time? Or...
Yes, you're on time. Sure, please carry on.
I'll give myself another 2 minutes and I'll wrap up. I just want to tell the story of Ismail Gama. He's a man that was arrested within the first couple of weeks of lockdown after he lost his job in a catering business. He was arrested at a vehicle pound in Lenasia, stealing car parts to sell, along with a colleague. He was arrested, he was detained in a security hut, and he was mercilessly tortured for a number of hours. They were then driven, not to the police station, but back into the township of Tembelihle, I believe it was, the informal settlement, to look for other people that had apparently stolen from the pound before. They were then subsequently taken back. Well, first they found the car parts at a chop shop. They were taken back. Journalists were called, and there were photos of Ismail Gama as he's lying mortally wounded in broad daylight, taken by a community newspaper journalist. He was then taken to the police station, and he died in the charge office as they were booking him in. Now, this is a murder that happened in broad daylight in front of numerous eyewitnesses. A journalist was called to the scene to photograph these suspects and to write a story about the police's success in this respect. And what happened to that case in the 18 months afterwards has really given me an insight into how dysfunctional the system is. First thing is that the station commander outsources this case to the police watchdog provincial office in Gauteng. So he does not take personal responsibility, or at least professional responsibility, for the command and control failure and the discipline failure under his watch that happened. There's a washing of the hands in this outsourcing systemically, routinely across the country. IPID then comes back 18 months later with a finding of criminal misconduct, referred to the NPA, but also not 18 months later, it was a year later, sorry. And then a disciplinary recommendation against 8 police officers implicated in this torture and murder. 6 months now down the line, the police have not enacted that disciplinary recommendation. So first they outsource to IPID. Secondly, and say they are waiting for the outcome of this investigation. But when that outcome and recommendation actually comes, we can see that there's a systemic disregard, which is lightened by the fact that, or which has been faded out by the fact that a year has now passed and the immediate shock and pain of that murder has kind of dissipated in some respect. And I believe they use and routinely rely on that delay as a way to not enact urgency and discipline. And I think in that little case study, and also in this data insight from Gauteng, we can see just how systemically the police service and management, down to the level of station commanders, wash their hands at all levels where they should be taking responsibility, leadership, and disincentivizing this kind of conduct under their command. And the final point is that the consequence of this, of course, is that repeat offenders are emboldened, that they are recycled back into the communities that they are meant to serve, and that they often become a scourge. And as that happens, the severity of their offenses might escalate as well, as has been related to me by IPID investigators who are on the coalface of investigating these kind of crimes. And that is a serious concern. And I think it's something which is really down to police management and the pressure that civil society can bring on police management to bring about a change in political will on this issue. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much for that invaluable contribution, Daniel. That is actually really shocking to some aspects. You think you know how bad it is until you hear these kinds of concrete examples. Just for our guests that are here, just please, if you have questions while our speakers are speaking, please feel free to use the Q&A function to write down your question, or alternatively, if you can remember it, at the end when our final speaker has spoken, we'll open up the floor for questions that are succinct and to the point. But in the meantime, please do feel free to type in the Q&A and we'll have those questions read out to our panelists who'll be able to answer it. So thank you so much. I'd like to hand over now to our third and final speaker for the day, Zianda. Welcome. Thank you again for joining us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Amanda and Ernest and everyone at Black Sash. And thank you to Aldred and Daniel for really sort of sketching, important aspects of the discussion that we're having here today. I think what I like to do and what I've done in my book, I'm going to plug my book for a second, can we be safe? What I've done in my writing and sort of research, on policing is I really, really like to start at the very beginning, of this country, well, at least the colonial history of this country, if we're going to talk about policing. I think that it's really, really important for people to understand that, way back in 1652 and in the 1700s and 1800s, we built a police force, or the colonial administrations that were present in South Africa at the time, built a police force and built a sort of police mechanism that was all about protecting colonial conquest and colonial interests and property. And I think what we have done over the years and over multiple centuries have really kind of struggled to divorce policing as it was, 2.5 centuries ago to what it is today. There's still so many remnants of both colonialism and apartheid in our police force. And I think that our reform efforts in the mid to late 1990s, as Aldred pointed out, I think we're very idealistic, in the idea of creating a police force for a country that is vastly different from what the original sort of police force was meant to do. And so changing the name and the nature from police force to police service is one aspect of it, but that I think really kind of failed to excavate a lot of the racism, a lot of the violence, and a lot of the brutality that occurs so much, in what police work is. And I think what Daniel, really sketched out in terms of these really large numbers, in terms of complaints against the police, really speak to the fact that we're struggling to marry the concept of human rights-based policing, community-oriented policing, and actual police work in a very, very violent country. So in that sense, you're now sort of seeing a very violent police force responding to a very violent society, and that being mirrors of each other and sort of driving sort of high levels. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be accountability. There absolutely should be. And I'm sure we'll get into the discussion, a lot about the lack of accountability that's occurred within the police force at an operational level, day to day within police stations, but also at the highest levels of leadership. We except for George Favas, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who was our first national police commissioner, in 1996. No other police commissioner has finished their term in office. They've all been, and they've all had to leave the office in disgrace, from Jackie Salebi to Ria Piecha, to, sorry, I'm forgetting his name, but, we're now also seeing Kehla Sithole and Bheki Cele, involved in this huge public fight and spat that truly erodes our trust in police and our trust in police leadership, both at the political leadership level, but also at the operational level. So we're really kind of dragging, I think, a police service into our current society and what we're trying to do in terms of dismantling inequality, poverty, and unemployment, but we're putting the police at the face of that. We're constantly sending police to respond to service delivery protests. We're sending police in when people were protesting not being able to access food parcels at the beginning of our very first lockdown in March last year. We're sending police into incredibly inappropriate situations, and they're bringing inappropriate solutions, of course. And those solutions have nothing really to do with crime prevention or really even alleviating the triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And it's honestly quite unfair for us to expect them to do so. That's not their mandate. That's not what we sort of look for in a police service. Again, that's human rights based or community oriented. And I think that's why we end up why we're in a situation where our police service is simply not meeting the needs of our society. I think that the conversation that we're going to have today has to really have both a long historical view of our police service, but also understanding the more sort of recent challenges, and a large part of that, again, being inaccountability, as Danielle mentioned, that lack of leadership across multiple levels, and really what the last decade has done to the police service, the politicization of the police service, the political interference that has seeped into many, many levels, and the sort of inability of the police, particularly crime intelligence, to rise to meet the moment, that insurrection presented, and really to sort of address many of those issues. That's also a part of it. The incident in Belleville is exactly part of that too. Not being able to rise to meet the moment where we're in a socioeconomic crisis, and the police respond with a large amount of police violence, really, and brutality. So I think that we're really at an inflection point, both for our society, but also for the police service. And I also do want to say, though, that I think that the right answer isn't necessarily to say we need to get rid of Bheki Cele, we need to fire him, or we need to get rid of Kehla Sithole. Those are only two figures in a large institution that is plagued by many, many problems. So I think we also need to go one step further and ask ourselves as a country and society, what sort of police service do we want? Then at the end of the day, I think we then can start to think about leadership and who we would want there. But there's many, many structural and systemic issues that need to be addressed, that need to be understood, that need to be contextualized. And then only, I think, can we get to a point where we can see real reform of the police service, and in a way that makes sense, and that really reflects South Africa as we know it, and not a sort of old system and way of doing things. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your input, Ziyanda. I think that was it was really insightful. Thank you so much. And as I see the questions starting to mount in the Q&A, perhaps to just open up the discussion, perhaps this is to you, Eldred, and maybe you, Ziyanda, as well, in terms of what do you think the extent of budget cuts and austerity have to do with the state of policing? So what do you think the extent of budget cuts and austerity have to do with the current state of policing? And then after that, maybe I'll start picking up some of the questions on the chat, or if any of our guests do have questions and you don't want to type them on the chat, please raise your hand and I'll be able to pick you. Ziyanda, Eldred, over to you.
Okay, I'll go. Thanks, Rachel. To my mind, and in discussion with my colleagues, I'm going to throw them under the proverbial bus too, we would hold that there is no austerity. The government spends billions on social issues. There are budget cuts for sure, because the economy and the tax base is too small. It's too under-diversified, and it's too uncompetitive. And there are real structural problems as it is built. This economy of ours, we mustn't forget, is built on cheap black surplus labor and quite frankly, oligarchy. There are uncompetitive multinationals and huge corporations that actually control everything. And the Cape Town so-called water crisis showed that, from zero-day water to food supply and security, to who takes residence in a big mall and who doesn't, and who works where. And so to the lack of public transport, public healthcare, all the way through health insurance, and who's now vying for our soon to be, we hope, national health insurance. So I think we should desist from saying there's austerity, like there is no money in the budget. Yes, there is. What do we spend the money on? In whose interest is the money being spent? And that goes too for the police as to whether with more money, they're going to be more effective. The big South African solution to this thing seems to be, when there's a problem, we throw money at it. And surely we can do better than throw more money at a South African police service or the government or anybody else for that matter. So I just want to hold it there for a moment and say there is no austerity as such. The government spends billions on social issues. We really do need to consider how we spend the public purse.
Absolutely, thank you.
And
can
I add to that? A really important point. There's a new piece out today on ISS Today, or the Institute for Security Studies, written by Gareth Newham. And he really goes into the analytics of this particular issues around budgets. And I really want to highlight a point that he makes, in that in the last 8 years, so from 2012 to 2020, over those last 8 years, the SAPS budget has increased by 65.5%. So that's gone up from 58 billion rand a year to 96 billion rand. So we actually have to ask ourselves, this idea that there are budget cuts and there's austerity, but also that the police need more money, where on earth is that coming from? Where on earth is this idea that if we give the police more money, they'll be able to do a better job? That's not true. There's a huge mismatch between what we expect the police to do, how much money we give them, and the actual results at the end of the day. So I really want people to be very critical of any sort of viewpoint or any kind of points that are out there that the police need more money. They're actually an enormous institution with more than almost 190,000 staff and a budget of nearly 100 billion rand a year. We need to be asking, where's that money going? Because I can tell you for free, and Danielle can say so as well, it's not going to IPID. It's not going to accountability services or actions. So we really need to dig down deep and ask, where's that money going? How is it being spent, and for what purpose?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm just looking in the chat. I see that Zona Morton is asking, how do the panelists see the South African Human Rights Commission involvement in holding SAPS accountable for gross human rights violation? So how do we see their involvement and the Human Rights Commission's involvement in holding SAPS accountable? That I'm happy for anyone to pick that up.
I see we're all holding back a little bit. I mean, I think that it's a really difficult, not necessarily difficult question to answer, but it really kind of speaks to the fact that there should be, again, internal accountability mechanisms that should work. And I see Danielle is unmuted now, so certainly jump in and answer. But we should have a police service that doesn't need this completely external body to help hold police officers accountable. This should be part of operational and leadership functions and services. And so it's if IPID is failing, I think it's not the right answer to essentially say we need to have another Chapter 9 institution step in. We need to be asking what isn't working within the accountability mechanisms, how to fix that, but also how to then hold particularly leadership accountable so that we don't fall into the same trap again where again an agency exists but exists only on paper or only in name. I think that there is certainly work for the SAHRC in other bodies and in other functions, but I'm wary of essentially outsourcing a duty that should be something that police officers and the police service within itself is able to do, but clearly is failing to do so.
Absolutely. Sure, thank you very much. Renee asks, from militaristic force to demilitarized service and militarized again, what should the new form and shape be, and what should be in place to ensure that a competent, prepared, disciplined, and service-oriented policing? So essentially, what should the new form be? What is the ideal, I guess, is what we're asking here.
Well, if I can plug the work of the panel of experts, because it was state money, and we have to consider how the state debate, how the money actually finds effects and resonates in the public debate that should be around, as we've all said, the police we want, and therefore the police we deserve. And the National Development Plan speaks to this too. And the question of effectiveness, and all the Chapter 9 institutions should all have a collective voice in guiding this transformation project. These are not NGOs that sit there every time and respond to people. They should be at every table, plug in the rights of the girl child, the boy child. They should be considering issues of human dignity. They should be looking at issues of social welfare. So they should be present as our public expressions and our public interest groups equally lobbying and advocating, guiding and educating, and not being reactive in investigating cases. I think that should be a very small part of the work they do. So getting back to where we're at in terms of where this police goes, and these are words that I think, unless we have a debate about that and they need to resonate and that we all understand what we mean by them, what does the National Development Plan call for? It calls for a professional police service. And I can give you my take on a professional police service. And that is very simply a police class or group of people who can hold each other accountable on a day-to-day routine policing operation. A kind of police service that can tell the political class and representatives where to get off the bus, so to speak, and say that the how of policing is up to us. You set the priorities, you set the objectives, and you provide the policy framework, and leave us as the professionals, and then hold us accountable for what we do in terms of performance, effectiveness, and impact, for example, and the image that people have of us. A competent police service. So to my end, if I could say, I would fire every single police officer today, quite frankly, and rehire them through an appointment process. This was done in Russia, and we went to Russia on the public purse to investigate what they did. So it's this full transparency and accountability that it was public money that took us there. The Russians fired everybody and rehired only 70% of the people who came back after they went through an extensive integrity testing, after they went through extensive interviews and competency testing. And the 30% that got fired was senior management. To my mind, if you want to save the budget in the police, we can fire three quarters of the generals in the police, send them on early retirement, and actually get on with the project. So a principled police service is the other thing. And there's lots of questions around the use of violence and the use of force. I'll just say something about that and then leave it to my other panelists to say, if we have a police service that is principled, we won't necessarily only keep the actual person who committed the violent act or the constable, which is often a constable, a sergeant, or a warrant officer. We will also hold their supervisors accountable, because police do not use force, especially when it comes to public restoration, order restoration, or dealing with public disorder without an explicit command to do so. And where our police is failing is on the control factors. So to my mind, where are we going? What's the project we want? Let's implement the National Development Plan. Let's consider what the panel of experts has put on the table and what it means truly to be a demilitarized, professional, principled, competent police service that upholds and respects the law, while at the same time enjoys the highest level of integrity and credibility. And those are words that we have to collectively define for ourselves so that we have a shared meaning when we say that it's a police that has integrity, that it's police that has credibility. These are otherwise suitcase words that are absolutely meaningless unless we have a shared definition of them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. And I think if we have time, Renee, based on your questions, I'd actually be interested to hear from you what form of shape you think it should take, because I would expect you would have wrapped a bit your head around some of that. But let me just pick another question quickly. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Mary Burton and the house. For those who don't know, Mary Burton and Di, they are, what was I going to use? Veterans of the Black Sash. So thank you for joining us. Mary says, can we look to the relevant parliamentary committee for action to start changing leadership and accountability of SAPS? Daniel, perhaps that could go to you. Can we look at parliamentary committees to be able to see if we can have SAPS held accountable?
Indeed, yeah. So part of my work has also looked at the Parliamentary Monitoring Group's minutes on IPID and the police management's engagement with Parliament reporting back on these dismal statistics and outcomes for the cases, and on the disjuncture, the deep disjuncture that exists between IPID and police management, and also disagreement as to who's to blame. I said earlier that police management very often wash their hands and hand over responsibility and then don't enact when it is actually their time to do so. What I found is that many of these debates and points have been raised in circulation between different administrations, between different parliaments, under different committee chairs, and a deep frustration as well within parliamentarians who felt quite invested personally, but felt that the parliamentary cycle, I guess, the responsibilities and the deadlines on them made it impossible for them to really enforce. Incidentally, Parliament is able to issue instructions to the executive of enforceable instructions to the police minister and to the executive of government. I stand under correction here, but I believe that it is enforceable and legally binding. But this really has not happened in successive parliamentary committee for policing, parliamentary committees for policing. And the question is to why? If there's such outrage, as there often is, in the immediacy of a meeting, of looking at the statistics, of individual cases, bringing public attention to the issue of police use of force and accountability, why then is there not follow through in terms of legally binding and obligatory instructions from Parliament? And I think that's something that a lot of parliamentarians have kind of felt frustration about, the lack of follow through and teeth, but for which they themselves really bear a responsibility as well in terms of driving their committees, whether they are opposition or ruling party MPs, towards that kind of enforced accountability and instruction on the executive.
Absolutely. Thank you, Daniel. As I said, if you want to join in the conversation, please raise your hand and I will take your question while we read the ones that are on the chat. But I see Zona Morton's hand is up. Zona, can I please ask you to unmute your mic and ask your question? Zona, I see that your mic's mute. Yes.
Yeah, my mic is unmuted. Good afternoon. Eldred is known to me, and that's a specific question I actually thought he would answer. I'm not going to disclose the police station or the officers involved, but there were an incident, and it was definitely not Manenberg. It started with the first letter of the alphabet, where we found minors in holding cells that were beaten with a sjambok. Minors 12 years old and 13 years old. I discovered the sjambok in the fingerprinting office in the presence of a police station commander. This case is now, yesterday was a year ago that we started this investigation. And it was reported to the Human Rights Commission. We went back there 4 or 5 times and we kept on finding minors in the holding cells. Yet we're sitting today with a repeat of nothing's happened. So that's why I was asking, how do we then introduce a police force that needs to exercise based on human rights principles? If we have a Human Rights Commission that's struggling to hold police officers accountable because of the police portfolio committee that doesn't react on recommendations from IPID, because that's the claim that IPID's made, that they've made recommendations and the police portfolio committee doesn't act on their recommendation. I think that was a mouthful, Eldred.
Thank you, Zona. Since I was mentioned specifically, I would want to agree, and I share your frustration. Let me put it that way. I want to contend that all our Chapter 9 institutions, including the South African Human Rights Commission, should be present at every table. If they should have a representative that specifically considers human dignity and policing, maybe they should also have a role in our parliamentary committees. Maybe they should have roles when it comes to assessors that assess with courts. Maybe they should also have a role when it comes to sitting alongside IPIDs to consider how these things are done and giving effect to. Now, that's asking a lot from our Chapter 9 institutions. But let's be honest, most ordinary South Africans have no idea what our Chapter 9 institutions do, or where their voice resonates, and or how they give effect to their mandate. So a much more public and visible face from these Chapter 9 institutions, not going around crisis fighting, and not that we shouldn't be dealing with crises, but we should be dealing with it in a systemic way that continues to build the capacity of people at a local level. So if the South African Human Rights Commission has people that they entrust and support to be visitors, every single community police forum, for example, can have visitors and can rightfully undertake a visit to police cells. Yeah, they can make sure that people in remand are treated with dignity, that they get meals on time, that they are relatively comfortable, and that they are safe. What's the role of all our Chapter 9 institutions in supporting public institutions like CPFs to fulfill that role, for example, so that we don't put our Human Rights Commission under stress and expect them to run from pillar to post, and expect people like yourselves and other human rights monitors to be everywhere, but that we work collectively and empower communities to do that for themselves in the spaces where they live, play, and work, so that the Human Rights Commission and the commissioners themselves then can ensure that there's follow-up and follow through with things that has come from communities themselves. So maybe to diversify, to enrich, and to strengthen the voice of the Human Rights Commission, working hand in hand with communities as maybe one way to go, to put a lot more pressure on the public representative at the local level. That includes the local station commissioner and command staff, and then all the way through to Parliament. We got to hold each other's hands on this, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that question, Zona, and thank you for the answer. Someone says, Anonymous says, to the panelists, we tend to agree that violence is normalized in the SAPS. To what extent do you think this is part and parcel of the culture of violence, normalized as part of South African society? Yes, Daniel, I'm happy for you to go. Yes.
Sure. Something that I've been interested in recently has been the adoption of a vigilante attitude within visible policing, and as a reversion for criminal investigation at the first, when somebody's arrested, and police might be looking to gather evidence or to find stolen property or to find an accomplice. The example I used earlier, or simply just to punish, because there is frustration with high levels of crime within the police service and with high levels of violence. And I think that vigilantism as a temporary suspension of somebody's constitutional rights is because they've been accused of a crime, is something that is widely accepted in many communities, especially communities that are beset by violent crime and criminality in general, and do not feel like they have a voice or a service being rendered by the police. And I often find in my looking at these cases, I've often found that police officers embody that culture of the communities that they both police and that they are drawn from themselves, that they're an extension of a deeper pathology in terms of South Africa's frustration with violent crime, and also their own incapacity in terms of under-resourcing and perhaps lack of training in an effective intelligence gathering and investigation, and then reverting to that form of torture and other means of getting information quickly. Incidentally, that's a hit and miss. You know, sometimes it's completely speculative, and increasingly, I think if that becomes part of the culture, the shortcut and the shorthand that torturing a suspect affords becomes less and less effective, more and more speculative, and more and more abusive, and permeates really. And so I think that certainly there's a sense of an extension of a frustration, but also of a reversion to vigilantism that South Africans feel generally in the face of violent crime, and that permeates and filters into the police service itself. And that's something I think for us to look at as a society as a whole, as opposed to just projecting it exclusively onto the police service in every instance.
Absolutely, thank you. I see someone asks, Abil asks quite an important question. Has SAPS ever given an account of the money they spend defending litigation as a result of unlawful police conduct? I'm not sure if any of you have come across that in your various research and various work, where they've given an account of how much exactly they spend defending police sort of brutality litigation.
I can answer this one. I have slightly outdated statistics, but in again, chapter 5 of the book, I looked at a research piece by a researcher named Gwen Deremaker, and she really sort of tries to unpack both the filing of police complaints, but at the same time being in very high numbers, but at the same time looking at what's called contingent liability. So that's essentially, and multiple government departments do this, but particularly within the police service, that's a part of the budget or a line item of the budget that speaks to litigation that the police are involved in. And in 2014 and 2015, and of course this number is not for just necessarily cases arising from unlawful police behavior, but that contingent liability stood at 26 billion rand. So we're talking about a large part of the police budget that essentially goes to defending, or the police defending themselves against civil complaints, particularly brought against them by the public. So I think that really kind of rings alarm bells, and that really kind of says to us, why are the police in court so often defending themselves against these complaints and these claims? And I mean, I would be interested if Danielle knows any more sort of updated numbers or has more information, but that is part of the problem, is that you almost have a budgeting for brutality, I think, in our police service that's incredibly worrying.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. And this one is interesting from Andrew. He's asking all three speakers, if you could wave a magic wand and change one practical, structural, or systematic thing about the South African policing overnight, what would it be and why? So magic wand, no financial constraints, no human emotions involved, you could just change one thing.
This goes back to what Aldred said earlier about principle-based policing and accountability. I mean, the police is a hierarchical structure, and I think that a big problem with how we approach accountability is that it's on the individual officer. And I think that the chain of command needs to be sanctioned, and it needs to be accountable for individual acts of abusive force happening under it. And I think if I could change one thing, it's to get these damn station commissioners to stop washing their hands when their members murder people under their watch and torture people under their watch, and use IPID as an excuse, and to be held directly accountable for what's happening within their precinct and within their people. Incidentally, the updated number, 500 million paid out by the police in 2019-2020 to civil claims.
Yeah. I would, if I could wave a magic wand, I would probably wave it across all police stations and try to get some sort of equity in resources. I think that a huge part of the issues that we have also with policing in the country is that there's an over concentration of police officers in neighborhoods that don't report high levels of crime, and just an enormous, massive under-resourcing of police stations in areas like Khayelitsha, which is what we saw with the Khayelitsha Commission that did its work about a decade ago, and really just kind of trying to balance police resources to where they're more needed and where they may be less needed. And I think that that's just by starting with that, we start to undo, I think, levels of over-policing, of under-policing, of police visibility not being there, of police officers saying, oh, we don't have enough vehicles, or we don't have petrol for the vehicles, for example. I think that practical sort of balancing really of where needs, where personnel resources and needs can be met, I think is incredibly, would change a lot.
Thank you. Let me just say that I think for me, this doesn't require a magic wand. It requires political will and public leadership, and that's to implement the National Development Plan 2030. I want to be able to, the Parliamentary Committee should simply ask the National Commissioner why he has not followed through on the plan to subject himself and all his senior leadership to integrity testing, lifestyle audit, and a competency audit. That's the first thing, right? And then to Parliament and to Cabinet to say, why have you not, even though you made a political decision to do so, took us through a parliamentary process and showed us the hope and the vision to say that we will have a national policing board that could set down clear performance standards, that could interrogate this litigation against the police, so that the police, for example, stand as friends of the court when it comes to the regulations of Gatherings Act and whether somebody needs permission or simply needs to give notice, rather than say, we will defend the indefensible. And if you lose that, once you've decided to defend the indefensible, as the National Commissioner or as the senior management who made the decision and the bad legal advice that they got, that should come out of their personal pockets rather than the public purse, for example. So my magic one is implement the NDP, do what it says we need to do, and to constitute with immediate effect a national policing board that can actually begin to provide critical direction, because the police have no doctrine. They seem to have no strategic vision or plan where they go. They seem to have no strategic security and intelligence architecture system that works, or a structure that actually benefits local policing at the most local level possible. And this doesn't require additional budget. It requires will. It requires the police to understand that competent people and other agencies may have to work together. Policing, of course, is something that doesn't only involve police work, which is what the police do. It's a joint up collective effort of a number of entities pulling together to be able to ensure that there's safety, security, and a quality of life for everybody. So that's my magic wand and wish.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for that question. Before I continue with questions, I just want to read a few comments that are in the chat, which I think are quite pertinent. They're not questions per se, but they are comments. I see Kwanele Pakati from the South African Human Rights Commission says that the transformation project as a form of building a new police service should not only focus on institutional building and leave the humanitization aspect behind. Albeit not easy, but changing human behavior is very important. I completely agree with that. Human behavior is a big component of big systematic change. Stephen says, I appreciate the more systemic approach to state violence and policing issues. I appreciated a piece that Daniel wrote where he called for awareness raising at local levels around why state violence is an issue. I also appreciate Zianda's point around the normalization of violence. SAPS officers are violent because we, the state, citizens and others do not see it as a big issue. Thank you, Stephen. That's actually a great point. Stephen again says that I like the point that you raised, Eldred. Oh, sorry, I've just lost that. I like the point that you raised, Eldred. CR7 is often looking for ways to cut budget. Maybe part of our advocacy should be to highlight what percentage of the SAPS budget is used towards paying senior non-essential staff. Great, so those are just some of the comments that are in the chat currently. So thank you so much everyone for your input. Please don't forget, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to speak. Someone asks, Mary Burton says, thank you, excellent proposal, Eldred. Someone also asks, is the policeman's policing capabilities to combat violence or non-violence crime not impeded by the Constitution and amendments to the Criminal Procedure Act? So is a policeman's capabilities to combat violent or non-violent crime not impeded by the Constitution and the amendments to the Criminal Procedure Act? I'm not sure if anyone wants to take that.
I'll go first with a little bit I can contribute to this.
Sure.
The Constitution, even with its Bill of Rights, and I think this is recognized, perhaps we need to place more emphasis on this. Yes, it gives us rights and it also gives us responsibilities as citizens. We need to remember that police, even though we speak about police powers, they have authority vested in them by legislation and the Constitution that we, the public, give to them by virtue of the fact that it went through a legislative process. In the use of those powers or authorities, they need to account, if not before the fact, then after the fact, and we need to be mindful about what we're trying to do. The Constitution doesn't in any way suggest that our civil liberties and our freedoms and our rights cannot be limited. We made a decision as a country to say that we will not take a life. So the death penalty was taken off the table. And especially when the Criminal Procedure Act came, said you cannot shoot somebody in the back, for example, or a fleeing suspect, which seems to have been the case not so long ago. So if anybody's suggesting that it's a lack of a death penalty or the lack of the ability to use unbridled, unchecked, and disproportionate violence, then maybe we should go back and reread the Constitution, because that's not what it's saying. What we hope we are saying to the police, and I think they've proven themselves to be finding this rather difficult, and that is to say that in restricting our rights and our freedoms, they can still uphold our dignity, yeah? And that they can still ensure that we have a right to life. This is the two things that we need to judge them by, rather than the fact that he's arrested me. I used to run a program for the South African Police Service that had a very cheeky byline, and it said, can you arrest somebody and they say thank you? Now the smart people would say, yes, yes, of course you can. Then we say, what do you mean by that? It's in the manner that you seeking to arrest the person. No woman or man should have their dignity trampled on in the course of an arrest, for example. Yeah? So they shouldn't be dragged out by their hair. They shouldn't be and all the things that the South African Human Rights Commission and everybody else has actually commented on. So I don't think the issue is about constitutionality. I don't think it's the Criminal Procedure Act. It's that culture of violence that Sianda and others have been spoken about, and the routine policing practice that seems not to have caught up with the constitutional democracy that we're living in, and that we're living in a place where you and I, as ordinary citizens, can question the police. We can say to them, excuse me, officer, why are you doing this? Why are you coming to my house? Please tell me what this is about. Why are you arresting me? No, I don't want to do certain things without you providing me with an opportunity to speak up. Yes, I'm going to stay quiet and not incriminate myself. So for me, it's not an issue of constitutionality. It's a question of public leadership within the police. It's a question of what we expect from the police. And it's a question of not us acquiescing and not challenging routine police practice that is unconstitutional and undemocratic. And also, a professional police class will see one police officer. Maybe I'm naive to believe that this is achievable, but one police officer should be able to tell another police officer, excuse me, step over here. Hey, what you doing there? Maybe you should desist from doing that. How can we deal with this situation differently? That's what we're looking for in the caliber and timbre of the kind of police officer that we send out there. I don't think it's an issue of constitutionality. I don't think it's an issue of the Criminal Procedure Act, because it does say to the police, you can use the force to protect life from an imminent threat. The force, however, must be proportionate, and it must it must be immediate, right? I mean, what's the principles? I forget my use of
reasonable.
They must be proportionate, reasonable, and necessary as the other criteria. And what we've seen is continued violations of police using force when it's not necessary, not proportionate, and definitely there's no imminent threat to life.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And maybe just to add to that, I would argue that, in fact, what the Criminal Procedure Amendment Acts do is they clarify the space, right? Because the use of force sometimes can be argued to be quite subjective. What I thought was, for example, a strong enough punch might not be to you or to the person next to me. And so what we find that the Criminal Procedure Act has sought to do, has sought to sort of put what we call in criminal law a reasonableness standard, in the sense that we're going to look at it not from your perspective, not from my perspective, but we're going to create this fictional reasonable man. And this reasonable man, when he looks into the situation, can this reasonable man agree that the kind of force that was used was necessary, was proportionate, and was proportionate to the circumstances currently, and was it in a way that ensured that you could sort of contain the threat with as minimal force as possible? So I think those documents, sort of like the Criminal Procedural Amendment Acts and the Constitution, what they do, in fact, is serve as a campus, as a guide of what is acceptable and what is not. Because as Eldred alluded to, what we had before, we had police officers chasing someone, shooting them in the back and claiming, they were in danger. And as a result of that was reasonable use of force. And these kinds of documents are there to say, no, if you shoot someone in the back, that person is clearly running from you and it's not an imminent danger to you, and those kinds of things. So thank you so much for that. Let me just grab another question.
Can I add on to that?
Sure, of course, please.
Yeah, just to say, the very good points that both you and Eldred have raised, and to then answer a question in the chat from Renee Ngwenya, if I'm not mistaken, sort of asking about police training and how that comes up. I think that there's also, what people don't necessarily realize is that there's also a difference between police training and police culture, right? So this also then speaks to a point that Danielle made earlier about how station commanders have an enormous amount of influence over particular an individual police station's sort of culture and the way of working. And from a fair amount of research that I've done and sort of looked into, I think what also happens is that whatever training and whatever sort of theory of policing and practice that's conveyed to police officers can very, very quickly dissipate once they're actually in a police station with a station commander who doesn't believe in those principles and living out and doing police work in that way. So we have, I think, a situation. I'm not at all going to say that our police training is perfect. Of course it isn't. There's always room for improvement, but we have training that lives on paper and that lives in theory. And then what it actually means to do police work at a station level and under the command of leadership that either isn't interested in doing that form of police work or that is fundamentally opposed to it, really, that has an enormous impact on individual police officers themselves and how they do police work. So I think that that's also something to always think about and to try and address, that there is a police culture that exists and that informs what police officers do.
Sure, thank you so much. In the interest of time, I'm going to take one last question and then we're going to wrap up. Thank you very much. Let me just see. The question essentially was around, is the training curricula compatible to the level of complexity in competency needed? So while specific outcomes about crowd control, streetwise skills, and law and professionalism, this is not always noticeable. How much are some of the police's inept behavior related to training or lack thereof in terms of what they get? So how much of it is lack of training and how much of it is just them not knowing what to do?
If I can just say something and also follow up from Sianda, then I'll also use this as my parting shot, so to speak. It's definitely the confusion between rank and role within the South African Police Service. Daniel had mentioned that it's a hierarchical institution, and anybody with enough pips on their shoulder can tell anybody else, no matter how competent they are, to stop what they're doing and to do what I say. Or do what I order you to do. The professional police service would understand that there are specific roles, and these can range from forensics to investigation to crime to intelligence, to all the host to providing support to vulnerable, to working across genders, you know, the whole host of spectrum of modern day skills that most of us would consider soft skills, knowledge, insights, the ability to build relationships. Those things are not necessarily celebrated in the South African Police Service. And I think that is something that we have to definitely speak to. So when we say training in the police, we need to make sure that the training is appropriate for, as one have already said, for the complexities and the emerging threats of the 21st century and the kind of democracy and development state that we live in working. And no, we don't have appropriate training and not enough of it. Training is by and large fallen to the wayside in the South African Police Service. And this is something that needs to be corrected. And finally, we also need, as part of the mandate of the panel of experts, was to put in place what we call a structured command. The international best practice is that you get command from operational level to overall command through to strategic command. And we often fail in the South African Police Service, both at an operational level command and a strategic command, because a lot of what we do is not pegged to any consistent and coherent strategy of policing within a developmental state. So all of those are stuff that needs urgent correcting, and there's enough good ideas on the table as to how to do that.
Absolutely. Then maybe just lastly, for us, the everyday people who perhaps don't have access to the knowledge and the resources you panel of experts have, when we witness police brutality in our spaces, what is the next step? What is the practical thing to do as a concerned citizen? Daniel, go ahead.
I wanted to interject something about quickly around the resources that we have access to. Something that has been an eye-opener for me is an access to this database of 47,000 cases against the police. And we've been working for 2 years on trying to clean and consolidate that database and to bring the progression of each case into its perspective. and we've finished, and we're going to be publishing it. This is actually the first time that I'm saying this publicly, but we'll be publishing this on a dashboard where anybody in South Africa will have direct access to the entire list of criminal complaints against the police officers in their precinct, more than 1,100 precincts represented. And they would be able, every complainant would be able to see where their individual cases got up to in terms of this dysfunctional pipeline of accountability. So that's just a teaser, perhaps an incentive to follow Viewfinder and to sign up to our newsletter, because that's where you'll first see it. And in terms of what to do if you're subject to this kind of violence, it's a very difficult question to answer, because I think the roles and responsibilities that and the institutions that constitute our police oversight mechanism have shown and proven that they are not able to help the most vulnerable victims stand for justice and often just closure and recognition for what has been perpetuated onto them. In terms of alternatives, I might hand this over. I know that there's civil society reporting channels, how effective those are, like report.org.za. I think it's important for records to be kept and for a network of support around complainants to be engendered. But in terms of other alternatives, I'll leave that over to Zianda and Aldred, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think to add and to wrap up this incredibly important discussion, I think that there's so much work that can be done, you know, in terms of supporting organizations that have been working for a really long time on police reform and police accountability, and will do so for a much longer time, you know, after this sort of moment. I think in a lot of sort of awareness raising or consciousness has passed. I mean, I always encourage people to follow and support the work of Lawyers for Human Rights, which is a civil society organization. Siri, what's Siri again? The Socioeconomic Rights Institute, that have done incredible work on police raids, particularly in Gauteng and in low income and inner city communities. Abahlali Basamjondolo does incredible work on police accountability and reform in KwaZulu-Natal, and a lot of neglected communities. And within Cape Town, the Social Justice Coalition also does amazing work. So I think that this idea that you know, police accountability and police reform is this enormous thing that is only going to happen at the level of parliament or only going to happen at the level of ministers and police commissioners, I think can really be demystified and understood a lot at the local level. I think that a large part also of what we need to do is elect a different kind of politician. You know, not a politician who believes in we need to give more money to the police, we need to have more police boots on the ground, but to genuinely ask critical questions of what the police are doing to work to prevent crime. What you know, what sort of at the local level, what ward councillors are trying to do to work with, whether it's neighborhood watch groups or whether it's community police forums or whether it's station commanders themselves, to try and really get information out there. That's also key and critical. And you know, we have an election coming up at some point, and I think we all should be asking pointed questions to those people who want our votes, to genuinely ask, well, what are you doing to try and understand crime issues, you know, within our local ward, and not just say, well, SAPS is a national competency, there's nothing I can do about it. I think that there are many, many ways to sort of, I think, take a bite out of this really big elephant. And you know, you don't have to necessarily be dug into research and to know full details. It's about really looking around your community and trying to figure out what we can do to strengthen the police, both the sort of police work, but also in terms of community safety. That doesn't necessarily just mean, you know, buying out of the system and subscribing to private security, because that's a whole nother issue too.
Great, thank you so much.
you very much, Rachel.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to hand over to Amanda. Thank you so much, panelists, for your time and just the amazing conversation that this was. Unfortunately, we're running after time. Amanda, over to you.
Yeah, I was going to tell the panelists that had it not been COVID, we have a great bottle of wine for each of them. But we'll make a plan when COVID is over. But thank you so much to all the panelists for being a part of today's conversation. Thank you, Zianda. Please go and buy her book, Can We Be Safe? I saw it at Exclusive Books, but I know it's available everywhere. So please support her and buy her book. Thank you so much, Aldred, for your contribution and for your support with the Black Sash and its iPad complaint. Thank you so much to Daniel, and please follow his page. That database sounds like it's going to be life-changing for communities. Thank you to our Executive Director, Rachel, for facilitating this panel today. And to the behind-the-scenes team, Koliwe has always been the MVP. And Esley also, thank you so much. Thank you to all the staff members who attended, old and new. I saw quite a few old staff members. Please subscribe to both the Black Sash's website, but also to Viewfinder. But thank you to our patron, Mary Burton, for attending, and many other very famous Black Sash alumni, Di Oliver, I saw Alison Tilley. Thank you. The Black Sash is very grateful for the continued support of people and also continued support of its donors to make this work possible. And we want to use today's opportunity before everybody logs off to invite people to please donate in their personal capacities to the work of the Black Sash in making sure that grant beneficiaries especially are protected from police and from any other state corruption that tries to influence or take away from social grants. So you can, there should be hopefully, I don't know if it's up, Ernest, but a donate link right now. You can go onto our website and make a monthly contribution or an individual contribution. Don't be shy. Alternatively, there is a snap scan, and if you've registered for this, we will send you the snap scan QR code. So thank you, everyone. If you want to make a once-off donation. And also the Black Sash is registered under Section 18, so you can also, if you make a donation, get it tax deductible. So that was me doing the awkward part of asking for money, but I think it's very important. Each of the speakers spoke about their work in the NGO sector. Zianda gave a very important list of other NGOs that you can also help, but the work of NGOs needs the generosity of communities. So please donate to us, but also donate to Abashlali and Siri, and just spend your money generously, is what I'm saying. But thank you very much for attending. Thank you so much. I think that's it. Thank you to everyone. And I'll get you guys your bottle of wine. Don't worry.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. I'd actually like to thank Amanda. She really pulled us off. And that's the thing when you do the thank yous, you don't get to thank yourself. So thank you, Amanda. And the entire Black Sash team working behind the scenes. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you.